What is it about the weather presents You Ask, We Answer. I'm your host, Mark Jelinek, and this week's question is, how do I properly select and cite a personal weather station? Well, enough hanging out here behind the microphone. Let's go take a look at some personal weather stations.
So personal weather stations have become very popular. As you can see here, you can walk to your local electronics store and pick up something that's about $25 or $30 that gives you basic indoor and outdoor information. So it's become a little tougher to find units to look at in stores, but you might be able to find a location around you that does have a stock of different units to consider. Here we're looking at an all-in-one unit that has temperature, humidity, rainfall, and wind readings for you, as well as an indoor unit that will display the information along with giving you inside readings as well. Okay, so we went in a store and looked at a few different weather stations. Let's get a little more hands-on with a few models that represent maybe two ends of the spectrum. And these are ones that I personally own. This is just a nice little unit for gauging the inside and outside temperature. It's not going to be highly accurate necessarily, but it's got a nice little graphical display that's easy to read. You can put it on a shelf. You might want to reference it before you go outside. You can see it's telling me, hey, that maybe some rain's coming in the future. And again, in the store we were in, there were a variety that have different types of graphical output. So, maybe if you're just looking for something inexpensive and want the basic temperature information, this would work fine. Now this sensor, it is important to keep in mind that it's not shielded. So if you have it outside, you're going to want to consider putting it in the shade, because it will be heavily influenced if it ends up in the sun and give you some inaccurate readings that aren't necessarily representative of what's going on. Now, here's kind of the other end of the spectrum. Don't get me wrong, there are more expensive units. These units can go in the thousands. That one we were looking at was in the tens. This is going to be in the hundreds. It's got a display unit that's not on now, but that's where all the information comes into. It also stores it and shares it with my computer. So I get all the readings from the outside instruments. Now, I have unlike the combo units we looked at, I have a unit that can separate. You can see mine has a lot of cable. Some of them now are completely wireless, even in that part, that it will communicate back so that you don't have to have a cable involved. This unit here, you can't really see the little tiny hole down in the bucket there, but this is the rain gauge area. Has a solar panel for keeping the unit charged and working, all the sensors working. The unit here, this is the part that would mount on a pole or a post. And down here, this is the shielding, the temperature shielding I talked about that the other one didn't have. Now all the electronics are kind of up in this top layer underneath, where it's got a temperature sensor, a humidity sensor, where the wind sensor plugs in, and where the rain gauge information goes. It also has the ability to plug in additional sensors for people that are using it in an agricultural environment. So you have that information available to you. And if you're really a weather geek like me, you can get a geeky weather watch that tells you the temperature and pressure if you're so inclined, although it's been sitting on my wrist, so it's not going to be very accurate. So again, the budget can run you from tens to hundreds or even thousands, depending on what you're looking for. Those combo units we looked at might be a good compromise. Those ran from about 100 to 150. Think about what you want the device to provide for you. Is it simple, kind of close information? Do you want highly accurate? Are you looking to hook your weather station up into a community mesonet of some kind? All these things will come into play in helping you decide whether it's this, something in between, or even something more expansive. Now, let's talk about citing of these personal weather stations.
So we're going to go vertical here in a moment and look at a suburban type yard and see if we can find an ideal place to site a personal weather station. Now I want to mention a few things before we get up in the air and talk about the three groups we're going to look at. One is wind, another is precipitation, and the last, temperature and humidity are going to be grouped together because those sensors are quite often co-located. You're also going to hear me mention different aspect ratios, and those are height to distance. So for instance, if I say 4-to-1 and the closest tree is 50 feet, that means the sensor should be 200 feet away from that obstruction. So let's get started and get up in the air here. Let's start with precipitation. Ideally, the sensor should be at least 2 feet off the ground, and at a low level, it can be near a fence using a 2-to-1 ratio to keep winds from knocking rain out of the gauge. But for larger obstructions, it should use that 4-to-1 ratio as well to avoid rain shadowing, is what we would call it, type situation. Of course, you also don't want to site it near a sprinkler system or anything like that that might cause splashback. From a temperature and humidity sensor standpoint, 5 to 6 feet off the ground, roughly 2 meters. Now, it should use that 4-to-1 ratio as well, but also key at a low level, it shouldn't be near concrete or asphalt, at least 100 feet or 33 meters away, and should be over representative ground cover, whether that's grass or something more natural. And lastly, we have the wind sensor. This one needs to be 10-to-1 in terms of its ratio. Should be roughly 10 meters off the ground. And ideally, if it's going to be mounted above a roof line, it needs to be at least 7 feet or so, or 2.5 meters above that. So I don't know about you, but I didn't see anything when we were looking at this yard other than some smiley faces where it would be a good location to site this personal weather station.
So you might wonder, where did I have to go to get out in the open far enough to where I might be able to properly set a personal weather station? Well, in this case, I came to a local park where some ball fields had certainly cleared out enough of the trees in the surrounding area. I still have some of the background there, but most of the buildings are pretty low. I've gotten far enough away from the parking lot, so I think if I went out somewhere where I could get out in the middle of this ball field and still stay clear of those trees over there, I probably could properly site and meet all the criteria to have all the sensors located in this vicinity. Now, if you're siting a personal weather station, you might actually want to consider that. Do you want to put it in an open space that might be available in your neighborhood or local park if you have some way to secure it and get the data back to you? Now, some of the devices, even with the wireless, it may not reach that far, but if there's a building associated with it where you can install it and still have the data transmitted back to you, possibly something to consider, something that maybe the whole neighborhood could benefit from. You're making that investment. But let's go back and have a little more realistic talk, because not all of us are going to have these lovely wide open spaces to utilize for putting our personal weather stations out. So we've gone vertical, and we've talked a little bit about the different ratios that you need to keep in mind with personal weather stations, whether it's the 10-to-1s, the 4-to-1s, the 2-to-1s. A lot, depends on which sensor and which guideline. And if you look in the show notes, I will put some links to the different reference documents so that you can pull those out. We've also gone into a park setting where we've taken a look at, what an ideal open space might look like. But let's be realistic that most people in urban or suburban areas don't often have that much space. So they don't always have that flexibility to put that weather station out in an open environment like that. So what do you do if you've got a surrounding that's got more trees and buildings and even pavement that you've got to take into consideration? Well, the first thing that I recommend that you do is actually do a little bit of a site survey of your yard. Go out and walk it. Look at the height of different structures, different things that you might need to keep in mind, whether it be distances and heights, and make note of those for the critical items in the yard, whether it be the house structures or the large trees, etc. Take that site's information and then sit down and think about what is it that's most important to you, which measurements, because you're likely going to buy a sensor that has temperature, rain, wind. You can add other sensors depending on how sophisticated of a device you choose, but those are the common things. Then go back to that site survey and even walk around the yard. Go out and stand in a spot and say, okay, if I were going to put the sensor here, I've X marked the spot. Look around you. Just do kind of a full look and say, is there room in my yard? And as you can see where I'm standing now, I'd be hard pressed. I might be able to, I might have a fair shot at having a rain gauge here, but aside from that, it may not be ideal for the other sensors. But mark a couple spots in your yard. And like I said, I think the visual reaffirmation is a good thing, even if you've done a site survey on paper. Then make your purchase. And make your purchase thinking about where you are now, but also where you might be in a couple of years. If you think you might move, and if you think you might want a more advanced sensor when you're going to have more space than you do now, something to keep in mind. But also, there's no reason to spend a couple $1,000s on a personal weather station if you're going to be in an environment where having that kind of sensor is not going to give you anything beneficial over something that costs $150. So when you're looking at the sensors, you know, we discussed a few of them earlier. Consider the quality of the equipment. Do read the reviews on different brands particularly, and take into account what different sensors might give you and what the right choice is for you based on the compromise of budget, quality of sensor, and the environment in which you're going to be placing it. And lastly, once you get that sensor and you go out and you sync that post, or if it's a split sensor, you know, you're affix it to the different locations. If you're going to share that data with the general public, either through a site like Weather Underground, where you can share that personal weather station information, or some other way, try to include that metadata that describes a little bit about the environment of where you may not be getting good readings and why that might be. Because I know when I had a sensor in Santiago, Chile, that there was no ideal spot, and you could see different sensors across the city, and they could be, you know, 1/10 of a kilometer, you know, or half a mile apart at most, and they have drastically different readings. And quite often, the urban island effects, if those sensors were not in comparable setups, would lead to very drastic measurement differences. And that's good information for people to have if they really are trying to reference the data that you're providing them. Now, hopefully you've got enough information to go out and find a weather station that'll make you happy, provide you some good feedback so you know what's going on right where you are. So in closing, I'm going to try to get out and enjoy this, what hopefully will be a little bit of stormy weather. In future episodes, we're going to do one on what I would call the perfect playing hooky weather, and I've learned that that can be called skiving or dumping or taking a sickie in other cultures, but whatever you call it, kind of that perfect weather that's almost too good to resist, that you find yourself trying to figure out a way to get out of what you have to do to enjoy the weather. And then we'll get back to the topic of evaporative cooling that I mentioned previously. Lastly, just from a support standpoint, I'm going to employ an old acronym but put a new spin on it, RSVP. And there's really 4 things you can do. Review, whether it's iTunes or whatever source you use. If it's a sourcing site like iTunes where they allow you to do ratings, give us 5 stars, of course, we'd love it. Whatever you want to give us, but write a review, leave some stars. Apparently the stars are the best way for other people to find it that have not seen the podcast or the vidcast. Share, tell other people about it. You'd be amazed at how often people just want to hear from you or have a personal recommendation. Validate. You've started sharing with us both feedback and ideas, and that's great. Please keep doing that. Your ideas are as good as any that I'm going to come up with, and I'd just as soon do things and talk about things that you'd like to hear about. Lastly, pledge. Currently, we do it on patreon.com/weather, and if you could do that, that would be great. In the future, we might have other avenues, but if you're getting some value out of the podcast, vidcast series, and enough that you feel comfortable supporting us in a financial way, of course, we always appreciate that. So until next time, and as always, have good and exciting weather.
This is 2 White Sofa Production.